Arriving 4 years after David Fincher had sworn off directing another feature film, citing that he'd rather have cancer than return to the director's chair for a featured film, the ghost of Alien 3 hung very heavy over Fincher's career, even though after its disastrous production, he'd returned to his more familiar terrain of making music videos and interesting commercials. However, it was a script for Seven which coming across his desk with the wrong ending, written by Andrew Kevin Walker, who told a story of an unnamed city on the East Coast where a serial killer is using the 7 deadly sins as motif in a series of murders. The story itself framed by 2 detectives, the elder detective, played by Morgan Freeman, Detective Somerset, teamed up with the short-tempered but idealistic new detective David Mills, played by young Brad Pitt. The pair using their weight to ensure that Fincher got the ending that he wanted rather than the lighter ending that New Line had been pushing for. In turn, the film really announcing Fincher as a director of note. I'm Owen.
I'm Kim.
You're listening to Movies and Tea. Let's take it to the booth. Okay, so tonight we're obviously talking about Seven, the phenomenal film from 1995, and a film which even now we're still talking about all these years later. It's one of those films that came out and just seemed ever so fresh, much like Scream did for the sort of mid-90s for the slasher film. Here we saw horror being refreshed because at this point it had been very much overwhelmed in, increasing numbered slasher series. I mean, we had like the Friday the 13th, the Nightmare on Elm Streets were both up in there in the 8s and the 5s, and just horror as a whole seemed very sort of in need of something fresh and new, and certainly with Andrew Kevin Walker's script for Seven, we finally got that, as here we not only had a thriller filmed with an extremely interesting motif, but we also had a very stylistic film with Fincher truly firing on all cylinders as he set out to paint a unnamed city on the west coast where it just rains all the time and scum and corruption. Just the backdrop for this city which these murders are taking place, as perhaps a sermon is being carried out as he forces his victims to atone for the sins that they represent. Now, Kim, I mean, obviously Seven is a film that I've seen numerous times before. I think it's the Fincher back catalogue. It's probably the film I've seen the most. What's your sort of history with the film?
I actually think I only saw it when it came out, and because I saw it so young, I never actually went back to revisit it because it kind of haunted me a little. Like, I still remember, like, when I was rewatching this the other day for our recording today, I still had, like, vivid memories of all of these sins and how, like, each of these murders were committed, right? So, I mean, to say that I didn't really need to rewatch a lot of it, just rewatching it was kind of like a memory of the deeper elements. So, I don't have a habit of rewatching movies a lot, except for, like, I don't know, very light and fluffy movies.
Yeah, I mean, there was just something about this film that just really drew me in. The first time I watched it, it was really quite unlike anything I'd seen before. The whole motif of using 7 deadly sins, and just the visuals that we're being presented with here were just truly unlike anything that I'd actually seen before. I mean, here we see Fincher teaming up with Darius Khondji, who's a French cinematographer, and he's probably best known for his work on the likes of Delicatessen, City of the Lost Children, and if you're obviously a fan of those films, you'll see like the same sort of style coming across here in Seven. The pair working very closely together to create this very interesting colour scheme. Here we've got those shades of blue, we've got the fungal greens, and everything is shot in very sort of dark rooms, and if we're have any sort of light at all, it's normally in sort of like a piercing red or shot with flashlights. I mean, the scenes where Fincher would basically set up pieces of cardboard so the actors had a guide of where to shine their flashlights just to achieve the effects he was wanting, and the whole time he's really setting out to capture this almost claustrophobic feeling of this city. None of the sets are opened. If we're shooting in a kitchen, it's a compressed kitchen. He wanted that sort of like almost beehive feeling of the city where everyone's sort of rubbing shoulders with everyone else. There's no sort of space to breathe, and it's a very sort of claustrophobic experience, and I think he perfectly captures that with this film. Right from the opening murder, as we see the victim has been marked for the sin of gluttony.
For sure. I think that one of the main things that really defines this film is right away we can see some of his signature, kind of like his trademarks that really shine in this movie. And that has to go with, obviously you mentioned it, is that gloomy city kind of feeling of always raining, and it's being very like just dark all the time, and all the rooms that it's shot in is very dark and very, because it's so sinful, I guess there's like a lot of gross moments and dirty and whatever, like a lot of things that coordinate with, badder trait, like worse traits in I don't know, just the general surrounding.
Yeah, as you said with the trademarks, this is the first of Fincher's dark urban settings. We'd obviously got hints of it with Alien 3, but that was sort of more sort of hidden under that industrial aesthetic. But here he really sort of gives us his first sort of taste of this like dark urban aesthetic that appears so frequently throughout his films. And it's almost like when you look at the Fincher films that these stories could all take place within the same city, and all we're doing is just basically kind of like The Wire. We're just like moving the focus with each story that's being told. It's sort of like with this one, we're going to be focusing in like the downtown areas where these crimes are happening, and then when we look at Panic Room, we're going slightly more upstate. So we're looking at sort of like more sort of like what would be like. Perhaps he would like to compare this to New York. This would be where we are now. Will be sort of like Hell's Kitchen, and when we go to Panic Room, we're sort of like more in the Manhattan area with like that. With those sort of more expensive sort of builds there. So it's really sort of interesting just how early on he nails this aesthetic, because with other directors that we've sort of looked at before, they normally take a couple of movies before they really find their stride, but I think because he spent so long making like music videos and doing advertisements, he sort of knew what he wanted when he was given this chance to work with a large canvas. And certainly here, where he's obviously got the backing of both like Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, they're using their sort of star power to really push across what Fincher wanted for the film. Because New Line, again, were trying to force a happy ending onto this film. They wanted to make several cuts, and like Brad Pitt in particular was like, if you don't shoot it with like these dark motifs, I'm just going to walk from the film. And that was basically all New Line needed to hear, just to leave Fincher alone on this one. So you kind of wish that Fincher had that sort of backing when it came to dealing with the executives of Fox and Alien 3, but at the same time, he was still, that was his first feature. He doesn't really have a lot of sort of weight, and we see this now when you like look at the Marvel movies and such, where they hire in these young directors just because the studio knows that they can get what they want, because these directors don't have the sort of like pull that a more experienced director would have. So that's why every Marvel movie pretty much looks the same.
Yeah, but then if we talk about Marvel, it's a whole different discussion of, we can look at all the directors and what they've done and where they've gone from those movies, and it's a whole different experience. So, I think Fincher is very lucky, I think, to have this in his second movie, because Seven is one of those, scripts and casting that, and paired up with his style, it's just so fitting. Obviously here I want to finish talking about kind of like the setting before we move forward. And I think that one of those things that are really obvious here is in just the setup of every shot. I remember, in the last episode, we were talking about a lot of trademarks about Fincher in general, and using those tints that you mentioned before of green and blue and whatnot. And here I remembered one of the first scenes of, just watching the two detectives walk down the street, and it's just all the storefronts were green, in shades of green. And it's something that I would never have noticed, I think, before, but when you watch this, you see them walking past, and then they're in these non-green shades, right? They're in white and black and gray and whatever, brown or whatever, or khaki or something like that. And you see these colors and they really like pop on the screen. They really like frame these two characters. And I think that, you know, obviously, you know, he has so much experience with filming music videos and whatnot, that I think that really does come into play, because he has this really, like, probably just a better grasp of just capturing a shot and framing those shots to what he wants in whatever different space, and with capturing the movement and just the interaction of these characters to really, like, give them that spotlight.
I mean, there's also a much overlooked effect here, and when it comes to the lighting effects, and you notice that the lighter the film is, so the more daylight we see, the more in control our killer is, the unnamed John Doe. However, when the darker the film gets, so the scenes where it's almost like pitch black, and that shows those are the scenes where the detectives are more in control of the situation. And I just love the fact that when you rewatch the film, you start paying more attention to how these shots are composed, because every single shot in this film is so memorably composed. There's so much memorable imagery. And this is a film where we have some truly horrific acts, but we never see them happen. We're always dealing with the aftermath of these effects. Everything's described, or it's given little flashes of what something could be, as we're obviously getting to a bit later.
But you know, that's kind of a signature of Fincher also, right? When he chooses these scripts, he always films it through the point of view of his characters. So we're not in the point of view of our antagonist, of the killer. We're in the point of view of our two detectives. So when they move on to a scene or whichever, and in this case, it's more kind of even Detective Somerset's point of view, because we see a lot of things through his eyes, much less, you know, because there was only, I think, a short part of the film where, like, Brad Pitt's character is really, you know, just taking on that scene by himself.
Yeah, when we have the crosstown sort of chase sequence there with when they go to John Doe's apartment, and again when we're in the apartment, everything's absolutely pitch black, and then when we're in the city, it's slightly lighter. When we hear our big conclusion, it's brilliant daylight. It's just a lot of fun little ways that the mood's constantly sort of played with, and it's as I say, it's just really, it's a film which just constantly like plays in the face of like all the typical conventions of this. This could be so easy to sort of like a Lethal Weapon style sort of clone of some like buddy cop drama. You know, you got the aging cop who's just like a couple of days away from retirement. You got the young hot-headed cop, and I think when we certainly look at these characters in Mills and Somerset, we have that perfect odd couple pairing here. They're both at opposite ends of the spectrum. We've got Mills, we got Somerset, he's methodical. He's really sort of seen what the city has to offer, and he's sort of become very sort of null to the world he sees around him. And there's a deleted scene that was originally supposed to be at the start of the film where we see him visiting a house that he's planning to buy outside of the city, and he cuts out a rose of that's in the wallpaper and he keeps it on his person. It's sort of like this reminder of what he's working towards now. And we play this in comparison to Brad Pitt's character Mills, he's come from the country, he's come to the city because he wants to make a name for himself, and he knows he can't make it a name for himself out in the country. He has to come to the big bad city to make it. And at the same time, you know, he's quick-tempered, he's always in a hurry, he's hot-headed, and there's so many times that we see this like being reflected, not just in their interactions with each other, but also in how they choose to approach the case. We have like the scene where Somerset goes to the library and he's getting all these philosophical books and he's doing printouts, and we compare it to Mills, who's basically getting the cliff notes because he can't get his head around like the musings of like Paradise Lost or Dante. These things are completely lost on him, so he's using the cliff notes because he has to try and keep up somehow. So
yeah, and I think that really, you know, that really highlights, it's the contrast of these two characters also, and the differences of them that really, you know, they have a little, obviously, like, kind of like shit talk towards each other. Obviously, like, Morgan Freeman is always like, you know, when he's telling him about his emotions and just kind of like separate it from the scene itself. the other guy and then Mills is kind of like a man of emotions kind of thing, because he's so quick-tempered. And then when it kind of like blows up in his face, all this, especially this talk in general, really is the focal point of what happens at the end. What really, is the reasoning behind what he's trying to tell him about, how he should approach the cases and not really bring that much personal emotions and too much, I guess, attachment to the case itself, but he should have kind of like a further perspective to have that kind of methodical approach that he uses to be kind of, to see the details, to be able to lock into the details. And their different approaches kind of play off each other a lot.
Really interesting where you see as the film sort of goes on, and as we get to like that third act, where you see these two detectives have found the middle ground, and in many ways they've rubbed off on each other. Where you can see like Mills is sort of slowing down, he's taking in what Somerset's trying to teach him, and at the same time we see Somerset just like giving up on his sort of like calm nature. And we see like in that third act where he's this metronome that he's been using to drown out the sounds of the city so he can sleep at night, he just basically like picks up and throws across the room and spends like his evening throwing his switchblade into his dartboard, because he's just so wound up, but he's feeling that same sort of anger that Mills has. And their initial introduction, how Somerset treats Mills like he's just like some rookie, even though Mills is an experienced detective. He's quite happy he just sends Mills off to like go and do door-to-door canvassing, and he'd rather profile the scene himself rather than be sort of saddled with this rookie.
But it also, I think, has to do with the fact that I think he's somewhat of a, you can also call it kind of, what do you call it? He's more of like a man of few words. He's noticing the details. He's not about, just, I don't know, shooting the shit or whatever, he's, because, Mills is there and he's just like talks about his experiences, really trying very hard to show that he has experience and depth in what he does. And he's had his experiences that warrants his position there. Whereas in many cases, I think Somerset is more about just seeing your actions will speak louder than your words, in that sense, where like him being able to solve this case and see those details and really focus on things. Because when you start in the movie, and especially in that first scene with Gluttony, you really see this Mills being very inexperienced. You start seeing him talking about this scene and being very, very subjective. He has his prejudices and how he just kind of like pegs the death right away, questioning whether it is a homicide, whether, like his kind of very, I guess, his disgust over obese people. And then you hear a lot of negative talk and a lot of judgment, a lot of prejudices towards the scene before really looking through the details. But as, Somerset comes in, he doesn't talk so much. He's there looking at the scene and really questioning, like looking for those details, which shows why. And then he's the one who notices, like, oh, the hands and feet are tied, and then there's all these these different things that are happening, like the bucket and all those little details. And it kind of like shuts Mills up for a second.
I mean, with Somerset, the whole character of Somerset was a little more chatty in the original script, and Fincher trimmed down a lot of the lines, mainly because, Morgan Freeman can do so much more with so little. And it really sort of works the character. I mean, when you look at the character of Somerset and how he questions things, it's sort of like, what did the kid see? Did you see any blood in the bucket? And Mills is sort of like more rapid fire. It's sort of like, oh, did you check the pulse? Did you do this? Did you do that? And when he's like looking in the bucket, and he's sort of like, oh, it's just full of shit, and he's sort of like, and Somerset's only reaction, he's like completely unfazed by this. It's almost like he was expecting to wander into the scene, and he's all like, oh, do you see any blood? And Mills is just like, completely disgusted and can't understand how he can remain so calm in this grotesque scene that's laid out before them, because here we have like a morbidly obese man who's been left lying face down in spaghetti sauce. And as we find out later, I mean, this is a man who's been forced to eat himself to death and to his stomach burst. This is how John Doe's decided to play out the sin of gluttony. And just all those little details we see around, it's just like how that, when we go in and we see how the victim's sort of like framed in the center of the frame, and when we go back to the scene, how all these little details come into frame. We're constantly looking over the shoulder. So Fincher's shooting this in almost like reality TV sort of style. It's like you're watching like the most extreme episode of Cops at times, like the way the camera moves in this. And I just love as well the fact that every single crime scene is always so different. There's no sort of like repetition in there. They're each sort of meticulously set up and presented as Somerset highlights. They're presented like sermons that we're supposed to be taking in, and obviously they're all based around these 7 deadly sins. And I think that was always one of the big appeals when I heard about the concept and it first came out. It's like, well, how are they going to do, this sin? How do you do sloth? How do you do lust? And it was sort of like, that was like my main sort of joy, is just to find out how you do all these sins. And the fact that when you watch it and there's this whole deeper story, how this investigation is carried out, it just really adds a whole another level to it, other than just like this, almost like cheap thrill of seeing people bumped off in very sort of gruesome ways.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that I think in a second watch or whatnot, you see a lot more of the details. There is a lot of depth, and the story itself is very twofold, right? On one side, we're talking about finding this killer who is executing people using these 7 sins, but at the same time, you're also seeing pretty much the discussion of what makes a detective, right? Your different views about being a detective between Somerset and Mills, because Mills has his experience, obviously, and then Somerset has his other experiences, and the reasoning of why Somerset is so set on leaving after this week. Why is he so set on leaving the job? What is his reasons for quitting? And that becomes kind of like a central focus of talk as to why he's leaving, and it brings up a lot of deeper conversation between the two of just how they see the city and how they see the job and the values of the job and the society around them and just being around, and how they treat the different of all these bad things that you have to deal with, especially when they're working in homicide, and it puts even more into play when you're seeing that his last case is this gruesome series of crimes based on sins, in this already pretty gloomy set that he's thinking about, as he's leaving this office, and explains why he doesn't want this to be the last job that he did, the last case that he does.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly as he openly admits the fact that because it gets built up so much in their mind that this idea, even when the killer like presents himself to the police, there's still this sort of disbelief as that this is the guy, this is this monster we've been tracking, this very sort of average everyday looking sort of person claiming to be responsible for these murders. So and I have to say, it's a real sort of credit to Kevin Spacey. I mean, this is probably one of Kevin Spacey's greatest roles, and he did this, and he did Usual Suspects back to back, and Fincher didn't actually know about the twist in Usual Suspects. So when he found out, he actually said to Spacey, "It's like, what the hell, man? You trying to be the criminal mastermind in all the movies?" I mean, Fincher, again, he really closely defended like whether Spacey was the actual killer or not. I mean, he was not shown in any of the promotion materials. His name's not listed on the poster. He gets first billing on the end credits, almost as sort of like a, to give him his due. But he gets no mention in any of the sort of credits. So when he just sort of like appears out of nowhere, there is that is this the guy? It just seems like too easy. Like, what other film do you know where the criminal just hands himself in?
That's really the credit goes to the writer, right? because you can't really... I think it's a good move that they didn't put Kevin Spacey as, you know, obviously on the poster and stuff like that, because that would really ruin the whole secret of who is the person behind this, right? It kind of ruins that surprise, because that's the twist, and that's the great thing about this film, is that Kevin Spacey doesn't really come into play. He's kind of like the man in a trench coat, and then the man down the hall who's running away, and you know, the man walking from the distance, and this killer who's doing all these things that we're only seeing in the aftermath. And he really only comes out in the third act when he hands himself over. And you start seeing those little details of, you know, obviously him being, you know, who he is, and just, you know, the little traces that we have of him kind of being present throughout the movie, but you never really notice him being there. But he's actually been to these places, kind of thing. And then when you get to the end, you know, the thing is, we realize that he is a mastermind, because he literally wouldn't be there if he didn't want to be there. So he's like, while they don't want to believe that he's running the show, he is running the show, because everything that he's planned, even from that point of confessing or not and showing up there, he already has a plan to, you know, if they don't want the full confession and takes one option, he already has a plan that will save him from being in you know, a worse situation kind of deal. But it also kind of is very good because of a character that is so non-present throughout the entire movie. He plays such a deep role. Like, we understand this killer a little bit through his actions, and just how smart he actually is by just that one scene of, like, one finale moment of him showing up. I mean, you
say that, but at the same time, we take into consideration, we're given bits and pieces of the mentality of John Doe throughout the film. The opening credits in particular, again, another startling opening sequence, a real trademark of Fincher, and here is really one of his best ones. As set to a reworked version of 9 Inch Nails Closer, we see the making of the John Doe books, which are giving us an insight into the mentality of these books that contain, you know, the thoughts and the psychotic ramblings of this man in the world that he sees around him. And at the same time, we're seeing him, you know, he's slicing the fingerprints off his fingers, and all this is showing in like little shots and spurts, and even like as the credits appear, they're trying to get away from the horror that is unveiling on the screen, and we're getting little flashes of bits and pieces. It's almost as though you're sort of like looking at the face of evil, and then you're turning away, but just at the sort of the key moment. So we get these little hints and pieces of bits and pieces that are there. And I mean, these notebooks that we see in the John Doe apartment, they were designed by Clive Piercy and John Sable, and Sable did the handwriting for the books, and the little, there's a little I'm trying to think what that thread is, the piece of cotton that goes between your books. The little bookmarks are all designed so that they represent the different sins, are all sort of color coded, and just the amount of effort they put into these books. There's so much detail that they put into the books. If you watch the making of featurette that's on the DVD, it shows just how much detail they put in. They put like there's like a suicide note from a convict that was like tear stain they threw in there. There's like all this psychotic like rambling. There's crime scene and medical textbook photos. All of this we get little flashes of when we see it as Somerset's flicking through the pages of the book. And I think that whole John Doe apartment sequence is really sort of like where you enter into the mind of the killer, because up until this point we've had little flashes, we've got general ideas of what trains he's working on, because we've had the scene where Somerset uses his contact, who we're never sure which branch he works for, but we know he has access to the library records. And that really had me wondering whether that's how true that is, that, you know, certain books in the library system would be like flagged and that your details could be passed along, which really makes you question what you rent at the library, and much less back in the days of when you went to like the video store and rented stuff, and let someone could see how many times you're renting Navy SEALs or something. So it's I think of all the sort of sequences, the John Doe apartment is probably one of my favorite scenes, just because it's one of those rare moments where we're actually getting to see inside the psyche of somebody. I mean, here we've got like the crucifix, and we see like these signs of him being like a religious fanatic. We see obviously the trophies that he keeps of his in the cases of his victims, like the gluttony one. He's got the little cans of spaghetti sauce, and we've got the photo for which obviously leads us on to the last killing, which is of his intended victim. So it's just so I don't think I've ever seen another sort of, you know, killer lair done as well as the one we see here. And the fact is, it's absolutely pitch dark, and this is obviously a key revelation for these two detectives. The fact that they've stumbled on the epicenter of John Doe's madness in many ways. And even though all the pieces are there, the fact that just the time constraints that they're under, none of it can really be used. Like, they've got all his diaries there, but they can't go through them all in time because it's going to take too long to go through every single book to try and find out where he's going next with the murders. But the little bits that we get Somerset reading and stuff is again, it's just these weird fascinating ramblings that of John Doe's head. The fact that it's hard to say whether he's sort of suffered a break, or the fact he's suffering that sort of classic illusion where the more insane you get, the more the world around you makes sense, which is what I always got from his sort of like world view that he seems to work under. So, and I think it really, when we have like the final sort of interview with him when he's in the back of the cop car, it really shows this real clarity of vision of the world he sees around him. So.
Yeah, I mean, he's a man who has a deep belief that's kind of, he truly, like, you start feeling like he truly believes that kind of like some higher power is like this. He is doing a good thing for the world by, you know, getting rid of these people who to him, you know, he goes off on a rant when they call them innocents, that they're not innocent. And how, you know, each of these sins is so unforgivable.
And I mean, we also hear of a killer who's so methodical in his approach. He never seems to be under any sort of pressure to speed up this plan that he's got in place. We find out, like, when we look at the Sloth murder, the fact that he's had this guy strapped up for a year, and he's been, you know, collecting samples, he's been doing these photos, the fact he hangs up air fresheners to cover from the smell and pays the rent so nobody assumes that's going on. And yet here we've got a guy who's so horribly mutilated and neglected. I mean, the fact is that, as the doctor says, you know, they could shine a flashlight in his eyes and it would kill him. It's just this real methodicalness, whereas other killers we see in other films are always like in a rush to sort of like, as soon as they get that sort of heat on them, they sort of like rush to get the next kill done. They start becoming sloppy, and John Doe never becomes sloppy at all. He's just, everything just seems to play into his hands the way he wants it, and I think it all rests on the much answered question of what's in the box.
But that's the thing is, you know, even up to that point, we start realizing that John Doe is someone who is, you know, like we call him methodical, and who's actually planned everything. And he observes even the things that you don't think he's observing. He's been around much longer than they've imagined, just giving him that edge where he controls the entire thing. Every single moment that he plans, he knows he's gonna win at what he's doing, if you call it winning, right? I mean, he's going to succeed at the goal that he wants, and this is what leads to, obviously, the final end game of making the choice of, you know, I don't know if we should talk spoilers or not, because I feel like that's kind of more crucial. So
I think it's been pretty much spoiled to death, but we'll just say spoiler alert from this point on then.
Yeah. Yeah, so, like, what, you know, like, to the point where, you know, he's planned it to the T where it's like he wants Mills to kill him to accomplish the final sin. And to have that kind of meticulous thinking, kind of once you get to the end, as we get to that moment, and he's kind of, you really feel like he's manipulating the situation to where he needs to be, he becomes such a more scary killer than when we were not only just, we were just looking at, you know, all those planned out scenes and all those planned out crimes that he had. That, you know, this last part was even kind of like shock after shock. You realize what he's doing.
Yeah, and when we look at the sort of key crossroad moments where Mills is essentially being set up to complete this be the final piece in this puzzle, and we should go to that shot of Doe, and we got the sun behind him, almost like this halo. He's like this twisted messiah who's been sent to make us all atone for our sins through these murders he's committed, that we're all going to have to atone for of what we've seen. And the fact is he openly admits, he's like, what I'm going to create is going to be puzzled over for years to come. And he knows, he's going into this, he knows the end game here, but in his mind that this is going to be the completion of this sermon he's giving. Because we look at his, and again, we look at his apartment. I mean, it's not just where he lives. I mean, this is his sanctuary, it's his church. It's like the representation of his perverted belief that, you know, society can be cleansed by bringing attention to these sins that are committed. And he even breaks it down, like why he chooses each of the victims. It's like, I chose the fat man because he represents gluttony. He would be the sort of man that you would point out in the street to your friends so they could join you in mocking him. And it's like, I chose the lawyer, and I'm sure you're all thanking me for that. I chose the disease-spreading whore, and like the woman who couldn't dare to be seen as ugly on the outside. It's like, every single one of these people he's picked, they're not just random people. These have been meticulously picked because they perfectly represent what he wants them to represent. So it's very hard to sort of argue with him. And even though we feel so sure the detectives are going to win this one, because we have the scene where they're shaving their tests and they're sharing a joke about workman's comp, and you know, it all seems like the setup, like, you know, we're gonna crack this case, we're gonna take this guy down, and in the end it's sort of like it's all for naught, even though the original script had a happier ending, because test audiences didn't particularly like the darker ending, and they tried to play around with it and not have Gwyneth Paltrow's head in the box.
But you know, I think that that's such a key point to what made Seven such a success, aside from, you know, obviously all the other things that we talked about, whether it's Fincher's talent and the character design and development of, you know, Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, and just in general, everything pieced really well together, like a really good script as well. But I think, you know, sometimes it's important to have these darker endings, and for Seven, I think if the ending was happier, it would not have made such an impact till today. I mean, you think about it, this movie came out in 95, and we're talking about what, like, 25 years down the road or something, right? And it still has that impact that you know, it's crazy to think about the impact that it still has on people, and you know how much people still really love this movie and still remember this movie. I mean, just myself to be exact, like I never rewatched it, but I still remember so many of the scenes so vividly, and one of those scenes I remember extremely vividly is you know, what's in the box, right?
And I mean, they tried to do it. I mean, they tried to have it so it's like Mills's dog said in the box, and they even tried, there's bits of the script that still remain there, such as the fact that he asks how the kids are, and then he goes in and plays with his dog, so it was supposed to really sort of weigh the audience things. And the sort of end compromise being that they have Somerset doing the giving that line at the end about how the world is a wonderful place and worth saving, and how he agrees with the second part.
Yeah, the world is a fine place and worth fighting for.
Which
and
is
he only agrees with the second part.
Every time I see someone like doing movie quotes, they always use that one. It's like, oh god, it's become more so worn out than the dead parrot sketch in Monty Python at this point. But it gave the studio enough confidence in that this was a slightly lighter ending, because it gave, Somerset the feeling that, he was getting some of his sort of humanity back, that he saw some good in the world finally, which up until this point he hadn't really. He'd seen a lot of people sort of squandering the world around him, such as like the security guards in the library, the fact that, as he points out, they're surrounded by books and they choose to stay up all night playing poker. And again, there's very few moments of sort of lightness he finds in this. I mean, he tries to have some sort of friendship with Mills's wife, who they meet in secret, and he admits that, he at one point he was going to be a father, but he made his partner give up the baby, and because he couldn't see a child being raised in this world around it. It was just, and she's being crushed by this world around that Mills, for whatever reason, he seems to be pushing aside. I think whether it's because of his career or just the fact he's so wrapped up in this case, but he doesn't seem to see this sort of like the same sort of scummy world that Somerset and Tracy see around, and Tracy just basically wants to go back to the simple life of the country, really. So.
But that all comes down to the contrast that we have between them, right? When they have this whole chat about just the reason for an argument over why Somerset is retiring, and just when Mills shares his views of just the job itself, you can see that he's, what you call it in the beginning, he's idealistic. So it could be ambition, it could be just he believes that this job is doing good to the world still, and that's because he's still young. I think that, a lot of times it's Somerset started off in that place where Mills is at right now when he was younger. But through all these years and living in this city and all the things he's had to give up and the regrets that he's had over, all the, like, just say, like, the baby and whatnot that and the relationship that he had, you can see that Somerset is really burnt out by just this world around him, this evil that he has to kind of keep, the world that he has to keep fighting for, and this evil that keeps coming up all the time, and all these crimes that happen that get worse and worse. So, and I think while we obviously dismiss Tracy's character for the most part, because she's Mills's wife, and when you initially watch the film, you don't think she's that important, but she really does play a really sort of a key role within the film. And when they were talking about casting for the role, Fincher wanted to get Gwyneth Paltrow in, and her people were basically like, no, Gwyneth is not going to be a head in a box. She is not going to accept the role. And he was lucky Brad Pitt was obviously dating her at the time, and he, nudged her in the direction, and she basically gave in and gave like a 10-second sit down for the reading of the script and announced that she needed to go to the bathroom, and that was basically all Fincher needed to see to cast her in the role. And I think her role in this film is so understated, the fact that she acts as this neutral, this go-between between Mills and Somerset, because the two are at loggerheads, and it's really when she invites Somerset to dinner, despite what Mills would rather do, because he'd rather just not have anything to do with this cantankerous old man who keeps pulling him down and treating him like some rookie. But it's over dinner that the two sort of they find that common sort of ground, and it's ironically over the fact that Mills lives in such a crummy apartment that we see that sort of first sort of glimpse of the human side of Somerset, really. The fact he's so amused that everything in this apartment rattles because they've basically been sold this crappy apartment, but they were only shown it when the subway wasn't running, so that they didn't realize how everything rattles. So Yeah, no, Tracy is a character that kind of grounds our two detectives. He kind of brings them back to the real world. They're more than, just detectives in this world of evil and crime. They kind of bring a little bit of light into these two lives. Just, that they have something other than just murders to solve.
Yeah. While we're obviously talking about the supporting cast here, there's some really great actors here we should really sort of note here. We got Ollie Emery, probably best known as the drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket, here playing the police captain. He was originally going to play John Doe, but then they got Kevin Spacey for the role, and he took on the role as the police captain. It's kind of a shock to see him not just shouting and swearing abuse at people for a change. We also get Richard Roundtree, Shaft himself, plays the district attorney. We also get to see, for people who love 80s cinema in particular, John C. McGinley as the SWAT team leader, who's just a human chameleon, and it's always fun to spot him playing random roles in things. He turns up in a lot of Oliver Stone movies for some reason, and you probably best know him from his role as in Scrubs. And then there's a lot of other little fun little cameos here and there, such as the person who plays the prostitute is actually Fincher's set director, and we get to see Morgan Freeman's son plays the fingerprint analysis technician. So there's you see a couple of the other sort of like regular sort of Fincher mob that come in and do the little bit roles as well. So and we obviously got Michael Matisse as the massage parlor owner, and Leland Osner as the crazed man who is forced to participate in the Lost murder, which I have to say that's a stand-up performance right there. So there's a man who's just been shocked to his core, and is to do fear well is not an easy thing. But I've never seen like someone who's just been like so utterly broken by what he's been forced to participate in. So
well, I mean, if you listen to the description of what he had to do, it's easy to imagine fear, isn't it?
So for myself, I mean, Seven remains this absolute masterpiece in Fincher's filmography. I mean, it's been perhaps overshadowed by other films that he's since followed up with, such as Fight Club and Social Network. But there's just something about Seven that just really can't be dismissed. I mean, yes, we all pretty much know the ending, and perhaps some of us have seen it numerous times before, but this is a film that even if you know what's coming up, but it's still an absolutely engrossing and fascinating film to watch. And certainly if I ever catch like it on whenever I'm flicking through the channels, it'd be one of those films that I have to sort of sit and watch right through to the end. And it's a very small sort of group of movies that belongs to, like Jaws and Predator, and this being another example of that. So, which is probably why I've seen it so much. Right, so on to further viewing, really. I've got a couple of ones, but is there anything you want to lead with, Kim?
I don't have a ton. I looked at more kind of like endings, like kind of more gloomy endings, or kind of things more along this kind of like twisty murderer kind of thing. And obviously, the first that comes to your mind when you think about twisty murderers would probably be Silence of the Lambs. And then the second one, which stretches a little bit further probably, which I remembered it being such a gloomy ending, and and it's one of the reasons also why I haven't gone back to watch it, is Gone Baby Gone. Yeah,
very, very good choices. As for myself, I would recommend another Andrew Kevin Walker film, 8mm from 1999, greatest movie year ever, directed by Joel Schumacher. It sees Nicolas Cage as a private investigator who comes across what he believes is a real-life snuff film and sets out to investigate the authenticity of the film, finding himself delving into a deep and dark world of underground filmmaking. And that's a film that it's really worth checking out. I know because it's Nicolas Cage, people tend to just dig holes in it because, they don't have to write properly, and it's just very cheap criticism to start picking holes on how Nicolas Cage acts and whether it's perhaps too overacting for yourself. But 8mm is an absolute standout film, not only for Nicolas Cage, but also Joel Schumacher as well. Another director who's often sort of tarred as being sort of throwaway just because he did Batman and Robin and Batman Forever. But at the same time, I mean, this is a director who also gave us the likes of Falling Down, as well as Tigerland and Phone Booth. So,
really good
as he puts it, I've made some crappy movies and I've made some good movies. So, Joe Schumacher is definitely a really interesting director in terms of his filmography when you look at the films he's done, and just, other than the sort of like one or two sort of misfires that he's had throughout his sort of career there. The other film I'm going to recommend, and that's 1 Hour Photo from 2002, directed by Mark Romanek. Again, another director, much like Fincher. He started off in making adverts and music videos, and has had less of a successful transfer into making feature films. But Mark Romanek's 1 Hour Photo, which stars Robin Williams as a photo technician. He works in a 1 hour photo booth at a supermarket, and he basically becomes obsessed with this family who bring their photos to him to be developed, and to the point that he starts working his way into their lives. Robin Williams, if anything, does crazy exceptionally well, and he's done it throughout his career. He did it well in Insomnia, he does it well here, and he also did a phenomenal job in an episode of Special Victims Unit as well. So if you ever get a chance to see Robin Williams doing crazy, definitely check it out. And here in particular is just an absolute phenomenal role. Perhaps it would have been what John Doe would have gone if he had been more sort of precise in his motives and worked in a 1 hour photo booth. Although they're saying that he does divert photos in his bathtub, so those would be my picks. And this has obviously been our look back at 7. But Kim, where are we going to next?
We are going to 1997, 2 years later, when he does The Game, starring Michael Douglas.
Yep, Michael Douglas, Sean Penn. Another underrated film in the Fincher filmography, and always exciting to see a chance to see Michael Douglas playing a man of power, which is certainly what we get to see with this one. So it's going to be certainly interesting to revisit. Probably one of the most overlooked films on the Fincher filmography. So it'd be worth seeing whether it's fairly overlooked or not. But hopefully you've enjoyed listening as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. And if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you happen to be listening to us, it really does help us out. But it's like leaving us a review. Let us know what you think of the show. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're also on Instagram as well. And you can check out our full archive at moviesandteapodcast.wordpress.com, which not only has our complete archive of episodes, the After Hours, the Shark Week episodes, we also have our Friday Film Club, where every Friday, myself and Kim each pick a film, and we put it together into a fun double bill. Sometimes there's a theme, sometimes there's not, but either time it's just a chance for us to talk about some really fun movies. Thank you again for listening, and we'll be back next time to discuss The Game. Good night.
A proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.